Hello again, everybody. This is Steve Callis. Speaking of sports, we're going to start a new occasional episode today called That May Be True, But. And we're going to start today with a fascinating question from the history of baseball. And that question would be, especially for baseball fans, how many most valuable player awards did Babe Ruth win? If I gave you A1, B3, C5, D7, what would you pick? I would pick probably 5 or 7 at least. He's Babe Ruth. He's the greatest player who ever lived. But the correct answer is A1. And the answer to that is, or the question to that is, how could that possibly be? He's Babe Ruth. He's the greatest player ever. And here are the answers. So that may be true. Babe Ruth won one MVP, but, and here's the but. So from 1915 to 1921, many of you know he was a great pitcher for the Boston Red Sox, and then was bought by the Yankees for the 1920 season and had two of the greatest seasons of all time in 1920 and 1921. And he never won an MVP award. Why? Well, from 1915 to 1921, there was no MVP award. In the American League, they didn't give one out, which, you know, in retrospect sounds absurd, but it was the beginning of baseball. The World Series had started in 1903. Nobody had come up. They had had an MVP, an unofficial MVP, in like 1911. But from 1915 to 1921, no MVP. Nobody won the MVP in the American League. But then in 1922, things changed a little. They started to give out an MVP award, and Babe Ruth won an MVP award. So we're going to flash forward now to 1927. Everybody knows in 1927, Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs, setting the all-time record that would last until Roger Maris, in 8 more games, I might add, broke Babe Ruth's record. If Babe Ruth had 8 more games to play in 1927, he would have hit more than 60 home runs. But we're not here to argue about that. We're here to argue about why Babe Ruth was not the MVP in 1927. And I'm going to read you some numbers. Lou Gehrig was named, his teammate, of course. Lou Gehrig was named the MVP in 1927. And I'm just going to compare the numbers. Ruth hit 60 home runs. That should have given him the MVP in a walk. And he also hit more home runs than any team. So when you talk about the greatness of Ruth, he hit more home runs than any other single team in the American League. There were 8 teams then. He hit more home runs, 60, than the other 7 teams. Nobody on the other 7 teams, no team had more than 54, I think it was. So stop for a minute and think how incredible it was. But let me read you a few more stats. 165 RBIs for Ruth, a 356 batting average. His on-base percentage, 486, led the league. Of course, his 60 home runs led the majors. His 772 slugging percentage led the league. His 1.258 OPS, which is on-base percentage plus slugging, 1.258 is video game numbers. It all led the league. And why didn't he? And I'll give you Gehrig's numbers. Gehrig had a great year. 47 homers, 173 RBIs. He hit 373. And his other numbers, on-base percentage, slugging percentage, OPS, which is on-base plus slugging, were all lower than Babe Ruth's. So why did Lou Gehrig get the MVP in 1927? The answer is actually simple, stupid, but simple, and that is, in the 1920s, in the American League, not in the National League, if you won the MVP award once, you could not win it twice. I did some research. I couldn't find out why they really, I don't know if they wanted to spread the MVP award around. There's no real reason given for that. But suffice it to say that once Ruth had won previously, he couldn't win the MVP award in 1927. Obviously the dumbest MVP vote of all time, because the guy who was the MVP, who was the superstar, who was the greatest baseball player ever, was ineligible, not because he did something wrong, but because he had already won an MVP. So that's the reason Babe Ruth only won one MVP award. When you're hearing all the records that people say about him, and 714 home runs and all kinds of things like that, at the end they always stick in, and he won the MVP, he won one MVP award. It has to make you think, how could that happen? This is how it happened. So here's another interesting take off of the 1927 MVP award. As you know, the Yankees were murderers row in 1927. Many people think the greatest team that ever played Major League Baseball. They won the pennant. They won the World Series. They had murderers row comprised of Ruth, Gehrig, and Bob Musial, who people forget but was also a great home run hitter. And in 1928, they did the same thing. They won the pennant, they won the World Series, they were an incredibly dominant team. So the next question after who won the MVP in 1927 is who won the MVP in 1928? And let me read you some numbers. In 1928, Babe Ruth, 54 homers, 146 RBIs, 323 batting average, 463 on base percentage, 709 slugging, 1.172 OPS, which again is the on base percentage plus slugging video game numbers. Lou Gehrig, 27 home runs. He dropped off from the year before, but 147 RBIs, 374 average, 467 on base percentage, 648 slugging, 1.115 OPS. Not quite Babe Ruth, but still staggering numbers. So who won the MVP? By now you know Babe Ruth couldn't win it. Lou Gehrig couldn't win it because he won in 1927. So they gave the MVP award to Mickey Cochrane. Now, for you baseball historians out there, Mickey Cochrane was a catcher for the Philadelphia Athletics, a great player, a Hall of Famer. He was the MVP. Let me read your numbers, and this is not to slight Mickey Cochrane in any way. But in 1928, the Yankees won the pennant. Mickey Cochrane's Philadelphia Athletics finished second, and here are his numbers. 10 home runs to 27 for Gehrig, 54 for Ruth. 57 runs batted in to 147 for Lou Gehrig and to 146 for Ruth. I won't compare the rest, I'll just give you the numbers. 293 batting average, 395 on base percentage, 464 slugging, 859 OPS. Again, the combination of on base percentage and slugging. These numbers, of course, pale in comparison to both Ruth and Gehrig, but once again, that rule came into effect. Since Ruth had won an MVP, Gehrig had won the MVP in 1927. They had to give it to somebody else. They decided to give it to Mickey Cochrane, who again would become a Hall of Fame catcher, but was on the second place team and had those numbers, which again aren't bad for a catcher, but paled in comparison to Ruth and Gehrig. In Mickey Cochrane's defense, the next 3 years, 1929, 1930, 1931, the Philadelphia Athletics, led by Mickey Cochrane, beat the New York Yankees for the pennant, led by Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth, all 3 of those years. So there's some solace there. But again, the stupidity, for lack of a better word, I can't come up with a better one, just shows that when you're looking back at the history of baseball and other sports, as we shall see in future episodes of That May Be True, but you really have to take it in context. So Babe Ruth won 1 MVP award. That may be true, but, and hopefully we've just explained the but to you. This is Steve Callis, speaking of sports. We'll see you the next time.